You know the sound I'm talking about. That drip, drip, drip coming from your bathroom sink or your galley faucet at 2 in the morning. Loud enough in that quiet little space to keep you staring at the ceiling instead of sleeping. Some of you have gotten so used to it you've started putting a folded washcloth down in the basin just to soften the sound. Or you leave the faucet turned just slightly open all the time so it trickles instead of drips, telling yourself that's somehow better. It isn't. Most folks put up with that sound for weeks, sometimes months, telling themselves they'll deal with it eventually. And then finally they call it in for service. And the shop hands them a bill for $150, sometimes $200, tells them the whole faucet assembly needed replacing. I'm going to save you that phone call today, because 9 times out of 10, that drip isn't a faucet problem at all. It's a $3 part problem, and I'm going to walk you through exactly how to find it, fix it, and never pay a service call for a dripping faucet again as long as you own this rig. No matter how many campgrounds and how many miles that rig sees between now and the day you finally trade it in. Let's start with what's actually happening inside that faucet, because once you understand it, you'll never look at a dripping tap the same way again. A faucet, at its core, is really just a valve. When you turn that handle or lift that lever, you're opening up a passage for water to flow through. And when you shut it off, something inside that faucet is supposed to seal that passage up completely, so not a single drop gets through. That seal is almost always a small rubber or rubber composite part, either a washer or an O-ring depending on what kind of faucet you've got. And that little piece of rubber is the only thing standing between a bone-dry faucet and that drip that's been driving you crazy. Rubber, no matter how good it is, wears down over time. It gets compressed, it dries out a little, sometimes it develops a small crack you can barely see. And once that happens, water starts finding its way past a seal that's supposed to be airtight and watertight both. That's your drip. Not a broken faucet. A worn-out piece of rubber smaller than a dime. Now there's 2 main types of faucets you're likely to have in your rig, and I want to cover both because the fix is a little different depending on which one you've got, but the principle behind it is exactly the same. The older style, and you'll still find these in plenty of rigs, especially if you've got an older camper or you bought used, is what's called a compression faucet. You'll recognize it because it's got 2 separate handles, one for hot and one for cold. And you actually twist them to turn the water on and off, same as an old kitchen sink from decades back. The newer style, which is in most rigs built in the last 15 or 20 years, is a single lever cartridge faucet, where one handle controls both the water flow and the temperature by moving side to side and up and down. Different mechanism, different exact part, but both of them rely on that same basic idea of a rubber seal wearing out over time, and both of them can be fixed with a part that costs you right around $3. I'll mention a third type too, since a handful of you out there with nicer or newer coaches might have one, and that's a ceramic disc faucet. These use 2 hard ceramic discs instead of a rubber washer to control the flow, and they're a little more durable overall, but they're not immune to dripping either. When these develop a drip, it's usually because a small rubber seal at the base, underneath those discs, has worn out, not the discs themselves, which almost never wear out under normal use. The good news is the fix follows the exact same principle as the other 2. You're pulling the cartridge assembly, finding the worn rubber component, and replacing it with a fresh one from a repair kit built for that specific faucet. If you've got one of these and you're not sure, the good news is most name brand RV faucets, Phoenix, Dura, Empire, and a few others you'll commonly find in RVs, all have their kits clearly marked by faucet model. So a quick look at the brand stamped somewhere on the faucet body, or a photo you bring into the hardware store, gets you the right kit without much guesswork. Before we get into the actual repair, let me tell you what you're going to want on hand so you're not stopping halfway through to go dig something out of a drawer. You need a flathead screwdriver, a Phillips screwdriver just in case, an adjustable wrench, and the repair kit itself, which you can pick up at any hardware store or RV parts supplier, once you know your faucet brand. Some folks like to keep a small dish nearby too, just to hold the tiny screws and parts as you remove them, because losing a little brass screw down into your sink drain in the middle of a repair is about the most frustrating thing that can happen to you on a lazy Saturday morning. Let's start with the compression faucet, since that's the simpler of the two to explain. But before you even reach for a tool, I want you to do one quick check that saves you from taking apart the wrong side. On a compression faucet, only one handle is usually causing the drip, either the hot side or the cold side, and figuring out which one first means you only have to open up one side instead of both. Feel the water dripping out with your finger. If it's warm, even just slightly, your hot side handle is the culprit. If it's cold, it's the cold side. It sounds almost too simple to mention, but I've seen folks tear apart both handles on a faucet that only had one bad washer, doubling their work for no reason. Once you know which side you're dealing with, here's how you fix it. First thing you're gonna do, and don't skip this step, is shut off the water supply to that faucet. If your rig's got individual shut-off valves under the sink, use those. If not, you'll need to shut off your water pump or disconnect from city water, whichever you're running off of at the time. Once the water's off, open the faucet to release any pressure still sitting in the line. Now take a flathead screwdriver and pop off that little cap on top of the handle, the one that's usually got a red or blue dot on it showing hot or cold. Underneath that cap, you'll find a screw. Take that screw out and the handle should lift right off. Under the handle, you'll find a packing nut, and you'll want an adjustable wrench to loosen that and back it off. Once that's out of the way, you can unscrew the whole valve stem out of the faucet body. Right at the bottom of that stem, you're going to find the washer I've been talking about, held on by a small brass screw. 9 times out of 10, when you pull that stem out and look at that washer, you're going to see exactly what's causing your problem. It'll be flattened out, cracked, maybe torn on one edge. Take that old washer off, put a new one on that matches the size, which is exactly what you get in one of those little faucet repair kits for right around $3 at any hardware store. Thread that valve stem back into the faucet body, tighten your packing, nut back down, put your handle back on, and turn your water back on. That drip is gone. Now for the single lever cartridge faucet, which honestly is even quicker once you know what you're doing. Same first step, shut your water off completely and relieve the pressure by opening the faucet before you start. On most of these, there's a small decorative cap on the handle. Sometimes it just pops off with your fingernail. Sometimes you need that same flathead screwdriver to gently pry it loose. Underneath is a screw holding the handle on. Take that out, lift the handle away, and you'll see the cartridge sitting down inside the faucet body. Depending on the brand, there's usually either a retaining clip or a retaining nut holding that cartridge in place. Once you get that loose, the cartridge should pull straight up and out. This is where you're going to find your problem, and it's almost always one or more small rubber O-rings around the outside of that cartridge that have worn down, gotten flat, or cracked. Those O-rings are what seal the cartridge against the faucet body, and once they wear out, water sneaks past them even when the faucet's supposedly shut off. A repair kit for these runs you about the same $3, comes with a full set of properly sized O-rings. Sometimes a small packet of plumber's grease too. Swap those old O-rings out for new ones. Coat them lightly with that plumber's grease, so they seat smooth. Drop the cartridge back in. Secure it the same way it came out. Put your handle back on and turn your water back on. Let me tell you about my neighbor Carl at a campground we were both parked at down in Texas a couple winters back, because this is exactly the kind of thing that happens more than you'd think. Carl had a drip going in his galley faucet for about a month, finally got fed up with it, and called a mobile RV tech out to take a look. Fella shows up, spends about 5 minutes poking around under the sink, and tells Carl the cartridge is a special order part. Gonna run him close to $80 for the part alone, plus the labor to install it. Total bill coming out around $180. Carl about had a heart attack, but he figured he didn't have much choice, being out on the road and not exactly set up to go hunting for parts himself. I happened to walk by while all this was going on. Saw Carl standing there with his hand on his forehead, looking like he'd just been told his transmission dropped out. and I asked what was going on. He showed me the invoice the tech had already written up, still waiting on Carl's signature to order the part. I asked him to hold off signing anything until I took a look myself. Pulled that cartridge out right there in his galley, and sure enough, it was one of the most common cartridge styles out there. The kind you can find a repair kit for at pretty much any hardware store or RV parts shop in the country. Carl looked at me like I'd pulled a rabbit out of a hat. I told him, "Carl, this ain't special, and it sure ain't $80. I drove into town, picked up a kit for $3 and change. We had it swapped out together in about 15 minutes right there at his picnic table. And Carl saved himself $170-some on a part that Mobile Tech tried to tell him was some rare special order item. It wasn't special. It wasn't rare. It was just unfamiliar to Carl. And that unfamiliarity is exactly what some folks in this business count on. Carl still brings it up every time I run into him at a rally. Tells anybody who'll listen about the day he almost paid $180 for a $3 washer. Now, why do RV faucets seem to develop this drip more often, and sometimes quicker, than the faucets you've got at home? There's a couple reasons, and understanding them helps you get ahead of the problem instead of just reacting to it every time it shows up. First, vibration. Same as we've talked about with other parts of your rig. Every mile you tow or drive puts a little bit of jostling and shaking through every fitting and every seal in that plumbing system, and that includes the internals of your faucets. That constant tiny movement wears rubber down faster than it would sitting still in a house that never moves. Second, water quality. When you're on the road, you're hooking up to city water at all kinds of different campgrounds, and that water varies a whole lot in terms of mineral content and hardness, depending on where you're parked. Hard water especially leaves mineral deposits behind on rubber seals, and those deposits actually accelerate wear. Kind of like sandpaper working on that rubber a little bit every time you turn the water on and off. Third, freezing. If your rig's ever been exposed to a hard freeze, even briefly, and there was any moisture left in those lines, that expansion and contraction can stress those rubber seals in a way they were never designed to handle, sometimes cracking them outright even if you don't notice a drip right away. And there's a fourth factor a lot of folks don't think about, which is pressure spikes. Some campgrounds run their city water at a much higher pressure than your rig system was really designed for. And if you're not running a pressure regulator on your hookup, every one of those pressure surges is putting extra stress on those same rubber seals every time you connect. If you've been skipping the regulator to save yourself a step at hookup, that's one more thing working against those washers and O-rings without you ever realizing it. I want to give you one habit that'll help you get ahead of this instead of always reacting to a drip after it's already started keeping you up at night. Every time you winterize your rig, or every time you do your spring startup, take 30 seconds and just run each faucet through its full range, hot to cold, on and off a few times, and pay attention to how it feels and sounds. A little extra resistance, a slight squeak, even a faucet that used to shut off crisp and now feels like it's taking a little extra turn to fully stop. That's your early warning sign that a washer or an O-ring is starting to wear thin, long before it ever turns into an actual visible drip. Catching it at that stage means you can swap the part out during a slow afternoon at home, instead of dealing with an actual drip driving you crazy, 3 states away from your usual hardware store. I also want to mention a mistake I see a lot of folks make that actually speeds up this whole process, and that's over-cranking the handle when they shut the water off. I understand the instinct. You hear a drip, you figure if a little bit tight stops most of it, a whole lot tight ought to stop it completely. But cranking down harder than necessary doesn't seal a worn washer any better. It just puts extra stress on that packing nut and that valve stem, wearing them down faster and sometimes even damaging the faucet body itself over time. If you've got to really muscle a handle to get your faucet to stop dripping, that's not a sign to crank harder next time. That's a sign the washer or O-ring already needs replacing, and no amount of extra force is going to fix that for you long term. Let's talk cost one more time, because I want this to really sink in. A repair kit with washers or O-rings runs you about $3, Sometimes a little less if you buy a multi-pack that covers several faucets in the rig at once, which honestly is worth doing since you're already got the tools out and you might as well handle every faucet showing early wear while you're at it, including your outdoor shower faucet if your rig's got one, since that one gets forgotten about more than any other and often drips the longest before anybody notices. Compare that $3 to what Carl was about to pay, or what plenty of you have probably paid without ever knowing there was a cheaper way. A mobile service call alone can run you $75 to $100 just for someone to show up before they've even quoted you for parts. A dealer service department isn't any better, and sometimes worse once you factor in shop rates and the time your rig sits waiting for an appointment. Days you could otherwise be out enjoying the very trip you bought this rig for in the first place. This fix takes you 15, maybe 20 minutes once you've done it a time or two. Uses tools most of you already have in a toolbox, and the part costs less than a fast food meal. One last practical note before we wrap this up. Once you've got everything back together and the water's back on, don't just walk away satisfied the second the drip stops. Run that faucet through hot and cold a few times. Check under the sink for any dampness around the fittings you touched, and let it sit shut off for a good 10 or 15 minutes before you check back one more time. Sometimes a slow drip takes a minute to show itself again if a washer got seated slightly crooked, or an O-ring didn't sit quite right the first time. Better to catch that now while you've still got your tools out and your kit still sitting on the counter, than to think you're done and find out that evening you've got to pull it all apart again. I want to hear from you on this one. Drop a comment down below and tell me whether you've got the compression-style faucets or the single-lever cartridge kind in your rig, and if you've ever gotten hit with a surprise bill for something that turned out to be this simple once you actually looked into it. I read every one of these, and I know Carl's story isn't the only one out there like it. If you've got your own version of this story, your own Carl moment where somebody tried to sell you a fix a whole lot more expensive than what it actually took, I'd love to hear that too, because stories like that are exactly what keep the rest of us from getting caught the same way. Before you go, if you've got a faucet dripping in your rig right now, don't let it become one more thing you just get used to living with. That drip's not just annoying, it's wasting water every single day it keeps going, especially if you're boondocking and every gallon in that fresh tank actually matters to how long your trip can stretch. And it's a sign that seal's only getting worse the longer you leave it. Grab a $3 repair kit next time you're near a hardware store. Set aside 15 minutes on a slow afternoon and put that drip to rest for good, instead of letting it cost you a service call and a whole lot more than $3 down the road. I'm Hank Dawson. Thank you kindly for listening to Roadside Wisdom.